This series is Reading Junior Classics. This is Volume 1, Fairy and Wonder Tales, and we will be reading Why the Woodpecker Has Red Head Feathers, adapted by H.R. Schoolcraft. When his wounds had all been cured by his grandmother's skill in medicine, Manabozho, as big and as sturdy as ever, was ripe for new adventures. He set his thoughts immediately upon a war excursion against the Pearl Feather, a wicked old manito living on the other side of the great lake, who had killed his grandfather. He began his preparations by making huge bows and arrows without number, but until he had no arrowhead. At last his grandmother, Noko, told him that an old man who lived at some distance could furnish him with some, and he set her to get them. Though she returned with her wrapper full, he told her that he had not enough to send, and sent her again for more. In the meantime, he thought to himself, I must find out the way of making these heads. Instead of directly asking how it was done, he preferred, just like Manabozho, to deceive his grandmother in order to learn what he wanted by a trick. Noko, he said, while I take my drum and rattle and sing my war songs, do you go and try to get me some larger heads, for these you have brought me are all of the same size. Go and see whether the old man is not willing to make some a little larger. He followed her at a distance as she went, having left his drum at the lodge, with a great bird tied at the top, whose fluttering wings would keep up the drumbeat, the same as if he were standing there beating the drum himself. He saw the old workman busy, and learned how he prepared the heads. He almost beheld the old man's daughter, who was very beautiful. Manabozho discovered for the first time that he had a heart of his own, and the sigh he heaved passed through the arrow maker's lodge like a young gale of wind. My, how it blows, said the old man. It must be from the south, though, said the daughter, it's so fragrant. Manabozho slipped away, and in 2 strides he was at home, shouting forth his songs as though he had never left the lodge. He had just time to untie the bird which had been beating the drum when his grandmother came in and gave him the big arrowheads. In the evening the grandmother said, My son, you ought to fast before you go to war, as your brothers do, to find out whether you will become successful or not. He said he had no objection, having privately stored away in a shady place in the forest 2 or 3 dozen juicy bears, a moose, 20 strings of the tenderest birds. He could retire from the lodge so far as to be entirely out of view of his grandmother, and fall to and enjoy himself heartily. At nightfall, having dispatched a dozen birds and half a bear or so, he would return tottering and forlorn, as if quite famished, so as to make his grandmother feel sorry for him. When he had finished his term of fasting, in the course of which he slyly dispatched 20 fat bears, 6 dozen birds, 2 fine moose, Manabozho sung his war song, and embarked in his canoe, fully prepared for war. Besides his weapons, he took along a large supply of oil. He traveled rapidly night and day, and for he had only to will or speak, and the canoe went. At length he arrived in sight of the fairy serpents, and stopped to study them. He noticed that they were of enormous length and of a bright color, that they were some distance apart, and that the flames which poured forth from the mouths reached across the pass. So he said good morning, and began talking with them in a very friendly way. They were not to be deceived, however. We know you, Manabozho, they said. You cannot pass. Turning his canoe as if about to go back, he suddenly cried out with a loud and terrified voice, What's that behind you? The serpents, thrown off their guards, instantly turned their heads, and in a moment Manzabo silently glided past them. Well, said he softly, after he had gotten by, how about it? He then took up his bow and arrows, and with deliberate aim shot every one of them easily, for the serpents were fixed to one spot and could not even turn around. Having thus escaped the sentinel serpents, Manzabo pushed on in his canoe until he came to a part of the lake called Pitchwater, as whatever touched it was sure to stick fast. But Manzabo had prepared with his oil, and rubbing his canoe freely with it from end to end, he slipped through with ease. He was the first person who had ever succeeded in passing through Pitchwater. Nothing like a little oil, said Manzabo to himself. Having by this time come in view of land, he could see the lodge of the shining Manito high upon a distant hill. At the dawn of day he put his clubs and arrows in order and began his attack, yelling and shouting and beating his drum and calling out so as to make it appear that he had many followers. Surround him, run up, run up. He stalked bravely forward, shouting aloud, "It was you that killed my grandfather," and shot off a whole forest of arrows. The pearl feather appeared on the height, blazing like a sun, and paid back Manzabo with a tempest of bolts which rattled like hail. All day long the fight was kept up, and Manzabo had fired all of his arrows but three without effect, for the shining Manito was clothed in pure wampum. It was only by immense leaps to right and left that Manzabo could save his head from the sturdy blow which fell about him on every side, like pine trees, from the hands of Manito. He was badly bruised, and at this very wit's end, when a large woodpecker flew past and lit on a tree. It was a bird he had known on the prairie near his grandmother's lodge. Manzabo called out the woodpecker, "Your enemy has a weak point. Shoot it at the lock on his hair. Shoot at the lock of hair on the crown of his head." The first arrow he shot only drew a few drops of blood. The Manito made one or two unsteady steps, but recovered himself. He began to parley, but Manzabo, now that he had discovered a way to reach him, was in no humor to trifle, and he let slip another arrow which brought the shining Manito to his knees. Having the crown of his head within good range, Manzabo shot his third arrow, and the Manito fell forward upon the ground dead. Manzabo called the woodpecker to come and receive a reward for the timely hint he had given him, and he rubbed the blood of the shining Manito on the woodpecker's head, the feathers of which are red to this day. Full of his victory, Manzabo returned home, beating his war drum furiously and shouting aloud his song of triumph. His grandmother was on the shore to welcome him with the war dance, which she performed with wonderful skill for one so far advanced in years.